The last time I went trick-or-treating. Not everyone remembers their final time going out trick-or-treating. People often say one year it was fun and the next year it seemed lame. It's always up for debate at what age kids should stop trick-or-treating. Some people say 12 is too old, while others say that they don't mind if high school kids show up at their house, provided they're polite and respectful. My dad always thought that the whole trick-or-treating thing was a little silly, but he was never against going with me when I was younger. That ended the year I turned 13, and it would turn out to be the last year I went trick-or-treating. Dad informed me early in the week that he wouldn't be going with me this year. He had to pull a double shift, and that if I insisted on going he was fine with it, but that I needed to be careful and meet up with some friends. I was filled with nervous excitement. I never thought I'd be allowed to go out alone on my favorite holiday. Well, my former favorite holiday. The only problem with my dad's requirement was that, truth be told, I didn't have many friends. I never talked to my dad about it, but I was pretty much the loner at that point in my life. Sure, I had a few schoolyard chums, but we weren't really on this trick-or-treating together level of our friendship. So, against my better judgment, I lied to my dad and went solo. Vampires were all the rage this particular year. It seemed like every other kid at my school had plastic fangs, long black capes, and horrible Transylvania accents. I want to suck your blood. Bleg. You know, the corny-ass Dracula voice. I, however, decided to go against the grain and dress up as my favorite monster, a werewolf. Dad spared no expense getting me a full-body costume, with realistic fur and all. I even had a full face mask, if you can believe that. I was excited. This would be a night I'd remember forever. Little did I know how right I was about that. After Dad set out, I made a little map of all the houses I wanted to hit up for candy. My neighborhood was decent, but I heard rumors that houses on Stevenson Road gave out full-speed candy bars, the holy grail for a kid on Halloween. Sure, that street was about a 20-minute walk, but I figured if I got through my neighborhood early enough I'd be there and back before it got too late. Dad said he would call the house at 10 o'clock to make sure I was home. If I wasn't there to answer, I'd be in trouble. A surprisingly crisp air blew past me, bringing the smell of distant candles, pumpkins, and sweets with it as I walked down the street to my first batch of houses. Kids were gallivanting around in sugar-induced hyper-spells, parents desperately trying to keep up with them, and the occasional older sibling trying to convince their younger, more gullible sibling that a pack of raisins was a fair trade for a Snickers bar. I was overwhelmed with joy at the atmosphere around me. After about an hour, I was nearly done with my neighborhood, and the haul was sweet. My makeshift pillowcase bag was just over halfway full, a sizable haul for me. It was 8 p.m., and I debated whether or not I even needed to go to Stevenson Road. After a brief inner monologue about this likely being my final year trick-or-treating and missing out on my last chance to get full-sized candy bars, I began the trek out of my neighborhood. Once I made it to my destination, the reward was oh so sweet. Not only did all the houses have full-sized candy bars, but they each gave me 2. My bag filled up pretty damn quickly after only another half hour. A few of the people asked if I was alone. They seemed a little concerned, so I lied and said my dad was just down the road in his truck. I'm not sure why I lied. I guess I was afraid one of the more overzealous parents would want to go with me for the rest of the walk or even take me home. Couldn't have that happen until I hit every single house on the road. After the final house, I made my way back down the road as a few of the houses began to turn their porch lights off, cloaking the road in darkness. It was a little after 9 p.m. now. So long as I made my way home, I'd be back in time for Dad's 10 p.m. check-in. If nothing else, Dad was always very punctual, and I realized now a part of him was likely still worried for me, even if he did think I was with friends. While I was making my way home, a cold wind blew past me. It sent a chill down my spine and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself this happened due to the cold, but walking back to my neighborhood on that dark road all by myself, I suddenly became frightened at my situation. I picked up the pace a little, yearning to see the street light at the beginning of the stretch of houses that made up my neighborhood. The sound of my heavy breathing and footsteps was the only noise I heard around me as I walked. Suddenly, a sound came from somewhere nearby. I could hear music, not just any music, but Halloween music. I stopped and listened for a moment to determine where it was coming from. It seemed to be coming from just ahead. Confused, scared, and a little curious, I jogged to see where the music was coming from. Just past the trees, I could see the glow of a porch light, and I made out an old gravel driveway. I stopped and looked upon a house that was done up with all manner of decorations and lights, and it even had a speaker playing the fantastical creepy music. I was in absolute awe of the marvelous home before me. It took me a couple of minutes to realize that I didn't notice this house on my way to Stevenson Road. Surely I wouldn't have missed this spectacle as I walked this way. I chalked it up to the lights have been off, thinking maybe the owners of the home were late getting off work. Stranger things have happened. While I was thinking this over, I noticed a man was sitting on the porch with a big bowl. We made eye contact, and he began to wave at me, at first to say hello, then to call me over. He was smiling and seemed nice enough. Just a normal older man in jeans and a rather ugly pumpkin-colored sweater. I looked at my watch. It was only 9:24 and I was nearly home. Surely one more house wouldn't hurt. I walked down the gravel driveway to greet the man. Making my way up the steps to his porch, it creaked under the unexpected weight. The man stood up, setting the bowl down and using a cane to help support himself. He smiled as I held out my bag. Trick or treat? I said warmly. Oh my, he started a wolf man. It has been a while since I've seen one of those. That's great, he said with a friendly chuckle. I was a little unsure of what to do next, so I laughed and responded, yeah, werewolves are my favorite, I said proudly. The old man leaned in and whispered, can I tell you a secret? They're mine too. He chuckled as he reached for his bowl, stopping suddenly. Oh, dear, he said, defeated. How did I run out of candy already with the late start I had? Guess I'll have to grab some more from inside, he said as he began to slowly make his way to the door. He gripped the handle and it opened with a loud creak. Stopping in the doorway, he turned to me. Why don't you come in for a sec, son? Get out of the cold while I fetch some more candy for you. Looking back at this moment as an adult, I know how insane my next actions were, but I was just a kid. I was trusting. The man had been nothing but kind to me, and living in a rural area, we were taught to always be polite. Oh, sure, okay, thank you, sir, I said as I followed the man inside. Walking past the threshold, I felt a chill go down my spine again as the door shut behind me. I shivered as I looked around. There was nothing odd about the inside of his home. It was a little unkempt, but so was my dad and I, so it didn't seem strange to me. The man turned to me with a smile. Why don't you have a seat? I'll just be a moment, he said, trailing off as he walked into another room. Sitting down on a chair, I waited for the man to bring me my goodies. As I sat looking around his home, I noticed a rather peculiar smell in the air. At first I couldn't place it, then after a few minutes I determined what the smell reminded me of: pennies. A strong smell of copper filled the air around me, but I was unsure what else smelled like that other than the now obsolete 1-cent coin. God, if only I had known, I would have run out of that fucking house right then and there. I sat for what felt like an eternity while I heard the man shuffling around in the other room. After a while, I heard the man yell from the other room, "You think you could come help me for a second?" "I can't seem to find where I put my darn cane," he shouted, clearly frustrated. I let out a sigh and stood up, walking towards the room his voice was coming from. Walking down the hall, the smell was getting stronger. It was almost unbearable. With a final step, I turned into the room the man's voice was coming from. As I stepped into the room, I looked down at my watch and noticed that the time still read 9:23 p.m. I stared at it thinking maybe my battery was dying. I heard a weird squishing sound as I walked and looked down at my feet. Covering my shoes was a sticky, thick layer of blood. I had never seen much blood before aside from a smell cut here or there, but I knew what it looked like, and there was so much of it, all over the floor and my shoes. I felt my skin grow pale and a cold sweat hit me as I slowly lifted my head. The sight that my 13-year-old self was met with was indescribable, but I will do my best to explain it. Hanging from the blood-soaked ceiling by large hooks were dozens of horribly mutilated corpses. Their flesh had been torn away in strips, and there were large bite marks in some spots on their bodies. Blood was still oozing from several of them into a pile on the floor. There were children, teenagers, and adults. All dead, all with the majority of their flesh missing. A couple of them were even missing their eyes. God, the way those eyeless corpses looked, their mouths wide open as if in a silent scream, capturing their final moments of life in horrifying pain. I was too scared to make a sound and too sick to my stomach to even throw up. I took several steps back as I began to hyperventilate, fear beginning to take over. Suddenly, I bumped into something, and I felt a strong hand rest on my shoulder. I nearly screamed as I slowly looked up to see the once kind-looking old man smiling down at me. He had blood all over his face and bits of flesh in his teeth. His eyes were now pure black, and he didn't need his cane to support his weight. I was horrified. Tears began to fill my eyes as the man opened his mouth impossibly wide, ready to take a bite out of me. I tried to run, but his grip was too strong. It was as if I was being held in place by chains. I closed my eyes, hoping it would be over quickly. I wished at that moment that I had just stayed home, or that my dad could have come with me. Suddenly, I heard a weak gurgling yell come from the room behind us. "Run," it yelled. I opened my eyes and looked to see that one of the bodies hanging from the ceiling was trying to free himself and making as much noise as possible. More skin tore from his back as he wiggled to get loose from the hooks embedded within him. "Run," he yelled again, this time with such force as if any life he had left was being used to make the sound. I looked up at the old man who was looking over at him, distracted and his grip loosening as he debated on going over to the man who was now taunting him. This was my only chance. I ran, faster than I ever had before. I made it to the door and flung it open. I threw myself out, but felt something grip my lower leg. Falling on the porch, I looked back to see the old man had slipped on the blood chasing after me, covering him in it head to toe. His mouth was growing even larger as he let out a demonic bellowing screech. With tears in my eyes, I kicked at him again and again until finally I hit him in the eye, which caused him to recoil. I threw myself off the porch, got up, and ran down the driveway. I didn't stop running until I reached my driveway. By the time I had arrived, my father was on the driveway, seemingly ready to get in his truck to come find me. He began to yell, but I just ran to him and hugged him. I was crying and wailing in fear. It caught him off guard, and any anger he had for me missing my curfew by almost 2 hours seemed to vanish. He took me inside and looked me over. The fur of my costume was covered in blood. He tore it off me and looked me over, tending to a large scratch on my leg. After comforting me, he asked me to tell him what happened. I could barely form words, but I managed to get out that a man down the road did this and had real dead bodies in his house. That he tried to eat me. The real blood all over my costume was evidence enough for my dad to call the police. They investigated the area over the next couple of hours. The next morning, a rather annoyed police officer asked me some generic questions. It seemed that they had looked up and down the road all night for this so-called house, but couldn't find it. They had me show them where it was, but it was gone. I couldn't explain it. I knew what I experienced was real, and I had the bloody costume and scratch marks on my leg to prove it. The police chalked it up to a prank gone a little too far and called off the search. My dad never doubted me, but there was only so much he could do. Sometimes at night, he'd go up and down the road looking for the mysterious house, but he never found anything. He spent years trying to find it, or the man I described. He would never forgive himself for not being there with me that night, although I'm not sure if things would have been any different. Maybe we would be traumatized together, or much worse. Halloween was never the same for me. Even after seeing several therapists, the idea of leaving the safety of my home on that night, or most nights for that matter, seemed impossible. Now, all these years later, I still think about that night a lot. What was that house? What was the creature inside of it? Does it only come out on Halloween? I'll never have any answers. But most of all, I think about that man who saved my life. It was likely the parent of a child who just wanted to go trick-or-treating and thought the house looked like a good stop. They were lured in, like a moth to a flame, by all the mesmerizing lights and decorations. However, even though the pain must have been unbearable, that man saw that the creature was about to kill another child and wouldn't stand for it. A final act of defiance and courage saved my life. He was a hero, my hero. I just wish I could thank him, or even better, that I could have saved him. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing to live with. So that's it, the last time I ever went trick-or-treating. The haunting trick-or-treat dare. I remember that Halloween night like it was yesterday. The air was chilly, the leaves crunched beneath my feet, and a full moon cast eerie shadows across the quiet suburban street. I was determined to make this Halloween the best one yet, and that meant one thing: candy. Lots of it. I slipped into my Grim Reaper costume, the one with the tattered black cloak and the skeletal mask that sent shivers down my spine every time I looked in the mirror. I knew it would be a hit, a real showstopper. My friends had dared me to go to the creepy old house at the end of the street, the one that everyone said was haunted, and ring the doorbell. They said that if I did it, they'd give me all their candy. I was never one to back down from a dare, especially on Halloween. As I approached the ominous house, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were shattered, and the paint was peeling off the walls. The overgrown garden was a tangle of thorns and weeds. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie, and I couldn't help but wonder if it was haunted. Summoning all my courage, I stepped up to the creaky front porch. The wood groaned beneath my feet as I approached the door. I hesitated for a moment, then reached out and rang the doorbell. It echoed through the house like a funeral dirge, and I took a step back, my heart racing. Seconds turned into minutes, and just as I was about to give up and leave, the door slowly creaked open. It revealed a dark, musty hallway with cobwebs stretching from wall to wall. I couldn't see anyone inside, but I heard a faint whisper beckoning me to come in. I took a cautious step inside, my breath hitching in my throat. The door slammed shut behind me, making me jump. I spun around, but there was no way to open it from the inside. Panic surged through me as I realized I was trapped. The hallway stretched out in front of me, lit only by a dim, flickering candle on a dusty table. Portraits of long-dead people lined the walls, their eyes following me as I walked by. The air grew colder with every step, and I could hear the faint sound of laughter echoing from somewhere deep within the house. I forced myself to continue down the hallway, my footsteps echoing loudly in the silence. The house seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning like a maze. Every room I entered was empty, but I could feel a presence watching me, lurking in the shadows. I finally stumbled upon a room that sent shivers down my spine. It was a child's bedroom, filled with faded toys and old, torn posters. But what caught my attention was the bed, which was adorned with a tattered, blood-stained sheet. My heart pounded in my chest as I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I rushed to the door and pulled at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped once again. As I turned around, I froze in terror. A ghostly figure stood at the foot of the bed, a small child with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice a chilling whisper that sent shivers down my spine. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Who are you? What do you want?" I stammered. The figure's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. "We want to play," it hissed, and suddenly, the room was filled with a chorus of eerie laughter. I turned and bolted for the window, desperate to escape. I threw it open and climbed out onto the roof, the cold wind whipping through my cloak. I didn't care about the candy anymore, I just wanted to get out of that house. As I made my way across the roof, I could hear the ghostly laughter echoing from inside. It seemed to be coming from all around me, as if the very walls of the house were alive with malevolent spirits. I reached the edge of the roof and jumped down, landing in a thorny bush with a painful thud. I scrambled to my feet and ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back. When I finally reached the safety of my front porch, I collapsed, gasping for breath. I had escaped the haunted house, but the memory of that night would haunt me forever. Years have passed since that Halloween night, but I still can't shake the feeling that something evil lingers in that old house. Every Halloween, as I hand out candy to trick-or-treaters, I can't help but wonder if one of them will be tempted to ring the doorbell and enter that house of horrors, just as I did. I can only hope that they'll be smarter than I was and resist the dare, for I know all too well that some dares are better left unfulfilled. I took 7 children trick-or-treating, but now they are 8. Kids are such bizarre, creepy little monsters. I had one tiny gremlin ask me recently if Satan's birthday is Halloween just like Jesus's is Christmas. Because I am a good grown-up, I said, "Sure, that's why we collect candy. For the big birthday bash." The kid in question is my daughter, by the way. Probably should mention that. Her real name is Astrid, but I'm not sure if she knows that because I usually address her as girl. As in, girl, put some panties on. Girl, who's ready for kindergarten? Not you. Where are your clothes? The girl finds clothing restrictive and prefers to prance around the apartment au naturel. A real chip off the old block. But it gets to be a problem when they're old enough for kindergarten. I've tried telling her that only wild animals run around naked. Like wolves, she asked. Wolves are her favorite animal. I should have answered that they show up each morning to the pack in suits and ties for their morning howl. Instead, I said, no, wolves do not wear clothes. The girl is now running naked around my home howling. I finally convince her to put some clothes on by reminding her that today is Satan's birthday. Technically it's tomorrow, but since today is a school day, we are celebrating with her class. Girls' kindergarten class is commemorating the holiday by marching to the nursing home to terrorize those who are closest to death. I have been told not to phrase it this way and that it is better to refer to them as grandmas and grandpas. To keep an eye on girl while she and her fellow wildlings hold the elderly hostage for candy, I have volunteered to chaperone. I am going dressed as a good parent, business casual, neatly styled hair, pleasant smile, and even temper, probably a PTA member. Not a parent who is raising a feral girl. Feral girl will go as a wolf. When we arrive at the school, the screams and wails alert me to the fact that everything is perfectly normal because the children are all rabid meerkats. I am given a clipboard with 7 names. I shepherd my little dumplings into a line for the 2 blocks to the nursing home. I cannot remember the names of these 7 little terrors, so I try to monitor by costume: Pumpkin, SpongeBob, Unicorn, Raggedy Orphan, Death, Spider-Man, Witch, and of course, Wolf, whose slavering snarls indicate she is now a werewolf. Honestly, the costumes are not great. Pumpkin is flat and deflated like the last gourd of the season. A unicorn's horn needs some Viagra. Spider-Man is the most convincing, tumbling around the sidewalk and spraying silly string as webbing. The other ducklings cry out and I have to intervene, and consequently, it now looks like my costume is spaghetti. Death is utterly silent and very much a method actor. Occasionally he swings around a shiny scythe that does not look PTA approved. I tell him if he's not careful with that thing I am going to take it from him, and he gives me a long stare. I point 2 fingers to my eyes and back at him. Then Raggedy Orphan bites said fingers. That is how I learned those rags indicate zombie. The words that come out of my mouth do not match my good parent costume, and all the bad little children giggle, and now here we are, parting the doors into the lobby where smiling old folks sit with buckets of candy, and I unleash the horde. Within seconds, Spider-Man is climbing the furniture, on brand, but I have to haul him off. Put me down, Vulture, he yells, and I can't help but wonder if this is a dig at my age. Pumpkin immediately needs to pee, but she's struggling with her costume. I tell Werewolf to help her undress. My feral girl is, after all, an expert. But girl misinterprets my directions. I spot her dancing around outside of her costume like a peeled banana. So I plunge into that chaos like an old vulture wading into the midst of frenzying hyenas, snatch the hands of girl and Pumpkin, and drag them to the restroom. When I return, I find the remaining children have collected around a dozing old man in an armchair. The 6 little hellions are laying candy on him like some kind of offering for Satan's birthday. Death is at the front, trying to put quarters on his eyes. I announce that they need to let him sleep and shoo them away like a flock of piranhas from fresh meat, and then approach the old man, who lounges with his head tipped back, mouth open. Some little imp even put a gummy worm in his open mouth. What if he chokes on it? So I take the worm out and take the quarters off. His skin is cold. The girl tugs my arm. Complains her costume is itchy. I tell her it is time to head home. I am a model good parent as I shepherd all my little hobgoblins out the door, on the way telling the staff they will need to contact an ambulance and likely the funeral home. My hands are only shaking a little. I deposit them all back at the school: Pumpkin, SpongeBob, Unicorn, Zombie, Spider-Man, Witch, Werewolf. Is anyone missing? No, the teacher informs me. All 7 accounted for. It's only later, as I'm patting myself on the back for a challenging day of parenting and ranking all the costumes on a quadrant chart in my head from hardest to poop in to most likely to be sexy if worn by Timothée Chalamet, that I remember that there was an 8th. How to survive camping. I went trick-or-treating with the man with the skull cup. I run a private campground. I have a set of rules to ensure everyone stays safe. Normally October is busy, but preparations for Halloween had wrapped up nicely, and I even had some free time this weekend to write about the people with no faces on account of the rain. Or, if you're wondering what this is all about, you can go to the start with this link. Things started to go wrong on Monday. One of the staff members came to me with an idea to put together a haunted house. Think of how much money we'd make, he said, which was certainly tempting. Then he said the second part of his idea, which was to staff it with our other campground inhabitants, and if a couple of people went missing to sate their hunger, then oh well. I looked out the office window and saw the children with no wagon staring at the house from the road and wondered where this idea had come from. He's taking an extended vacation. With pay. Somewhere outside of town, just until his head clears and his thoughts are his own again. Then on Tuesday, I had someone leave a 1-star review on Google for my campground because, get this, the solar showers were cold during their visit earlier in the week. It was late October and it was overcast. Solar showers. What did they expect? This is why part of my rules are dedicated to basic camping knowledge, because the general public is full of dumbass. And on Wednesday, the sheriff dropped by to see if we were all finished with our Halloween preparations. I'm pretty sure he thinks Reddit is slang for the new weird fad that the youth are doing, like planking or Tide Pods, so I'm going to go ahead and say this here. I don't like him. We don't get along. I miss the old sheriff. I heard the new one berating poor Turtle out in the driveway. She was getting the second box of liquor out of the trunk while I put away the first. Look, I don't drink that much. A lot of that is going to be Christmas gifts for staff. Yes, Turtle knows, I'm not ruining the surprise by saying this. Anyway, Turtle was doing her job by trying to find out the reason for his visit instead of just letting him blunder into my house. We've all been a little on edge about that since the Not Brother incident. And then next I hear him about biting her head off because doesn't she know who he is? I stuck my head out the front door and told her to go sweep the hay out of the barn, which is code for GTFO, and then invited him in. He sprawled authoritatively in the chair opposite me and rested his hand on his gun, which I suppose was meant to be intimidating, but I've survived a direct encounter with the thing in the dark and I just don't get intimidated by humans that easily anymore. I coldly asked him what I could do for him. There won't be problems this year, right? He asked. Referring to Halloween, of course. I'd already discussed my preparations with the local police force, and we had our points of contact established for if containment failed at any time. There's always problems, I replied, and I wasn't able to keep the bite out of my voice. I'm surprised you're concerned, seeing as this isn't an election year. So that was the wrong thing to say, and I paid for it with an overblown lecture about his duty to protect the people and how my campsite was a liability and blah blah blah. I tuned it out and fixed a solemn expression on my face, nodding occasionally, and let my mind drift until he seemed to be wrapping it up. Then I reassured him that yes, of course, I understood, and we were doing all we could to ensure this year was uneventful. When he left, I double-checked our preparations myself, cursing him under my breath the entire while. I also found Turtle in the barn, sweeping an already clean cement floor in obvious consternation. I guess no one taught her the code phrase. Whoops. Anyway, Halloween Day arrived with me already in a foul mood on account of the aforementioned difficulties. It didn't help that the day started with ill omens. A minute after midnight, the little girl woke me by rapping on my window. "Today is All Hallows Eve," she whispered. "Will you honor the dead?" It's been so long since she spoke to me. Sitting here, typing this, I still wonder if I imagined it. I rose from my bed without a word and went out of my house to the family cemetery. It's tucked in a grove of trees close to the house, sheltering it from the sight of the campers, encircled by a wooden fence with staff-only signs. I lit candles and left them on each of the grave mounds and remained there until morning, sitting in front of my parents' shared grave, until the distant screams of the little girl signified that the beast had come and gone. A headless bird lay on my front porch when I returned to my house. Could be a gift from one of the barn cats. Could have been an omen. Was probably an omen. I wish I could say Halloween was uneventful. None of my staff were harmed, despite the dancers deciding that they'd collect half my staff for their Halloween party. I received word via our radios that the dancers were processing through the forest, carrying torches and wearing masks. They were gathering up everyone they passed, dragging them into the procession, and forcing a torch into their hands. I felt I should go check on them myself, as the rest of my staff were occupied with a possible break in the fence and the police were trying to decide if the reports of a hitchhiker near the highway were just that or something else. I didn't make it far. I opened the door to my house and someone was there, standing directly on the other side, their form looming out of the darkness at me. I screamed and stumbled backward, regaining my wits enough to grab the edge of the door in an attempt to slam it shut. The visitor put up a hand and the door stopped short. I backed away, thinking of where my shotgun was stored, and then I saw the cup he clutched in his other hand. The white bones shone in the moonlight. "Oh," I said. "You." The man with the skull cup nodded faintly. I let the door swing open again, but he did not enter, nor did I invite him in. "I need to go," I finally said, as the silence between us grew awkward. "I need to check on my staff." "They're fine," he said. I heard wry amusement. "Hospitality laws are in effect." "So the dancers are fairies," I said. He shrugged, his gaze sliding away from the doorway. "Fairies aren't the only things that follow hospitality laws. Even humans practiced them at one point, though that tradition has sadly waned in modern times." "So they aren't fairies?" He ignored my question. "It's Halloween. Aren't there traditions to be honored?" I babbled an apology and went back to the kitchen and fetched the rest of my costume. I do the same thing for Halloween every year. It doesn't take much work, just some black leggings, a black turtleneck, and a printed cardboard box I bought online. I'm an alderman. Look, it's easy and kids love it. I put the head on and took up a bowl of candy I'd prepared just in case. I offered it to him, and he hovered over it a moment, and then his hand dropped to the side and latched around my wrist instead. He pulled me out onto the porch. I let the candy bowl fall from my hands, protesting in a sudden panic that I had work I should be doing. I needed to leave. He laughed and inquired as to whether I was confident that my preparations had been enough and whether I could trust my staff to do their jobs. I'm never confident, I said. I live in constant fear that I'm not doing enough. See, that's the problem. You never relax. It's Halloween. Let's enjoy it. He threw his arm around my shoulders as if we were friends, but his fingers tightened, digging his nails into my muscles until I flinched. Let's go trick-or-treating, he said. His tone indicated this was not a request that could be refused. I at least managed to send a quick text to my brother letting him know what was happening so he could take over making sure nothing terrible occurred in my absence. At the campsite entrance, we paused. The Halloween preparations served 3 goals: containment, protection, and surveillance. We have bundles of all the materials known to ward off supernatural entities hung up around the perimeter. This isn't always enough, but it keeps a lot of stuff trapped inside the campsite on this day when borders no longer matter and they're free to go where they will. This protects the town. Then, since all those malicious entities are trapped here with us, we need to protect ourselves. We've reinforced the securities on the various buildings and staff only leave in pairs with their protections. Finally, we have cameras set up around the campsite and most of my staff are running surveillance. If anything gets out, we notify the police. I can't do this year-round because it's far too labor-intensive. The man with the skull cup eyed the gate as I ran the flashlight over it, and then he turned to me, his thin lips curling up into a smile. "Would you," he asked politely, "open the gate?" I stared at him for a long moment. "You can shut it behind us." His words were very soft. Something in that bundle of protections we tied up and fastened to the bars of the gate was keeping him from exiting the property. "I'm not obligated to," I replied. "I could stop him right there. Easily." He considered for a moment and then said something, and I silently went to the gate, removed the bundle, and swung it open for him to pass through. Then I replaced the bundle and joined him as he walked off down the road that led towards town. I planned to make the trip into town on foot, and hopefully that would take long enough that he wouldn't have time to cause mischief before midnight. Then someone going into town stopped and offered us a ride because they recognized me and they didn't recognize who was with me, and of course, the man with the skull cup accepted, smiling that soft, smug grin the whole time we were in their back seat. There are still people in town who haven't read my rules. I don't hide the fact that they exist. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong here. They dropped us off at the edge of town, where houses sat side by side for a few blocks. Old houses with wooden shingles and gnarled trees in their yards. This was the only place to trick-or-treat in town. Everywhere else had acres of land sitting between them and the next driveway. Kids ran past us, oblivious to the inhumanity of my companion. Their parents were a little more observant. Everyone we encountered realized who I was, even with a cardboard box over my head. I've used this costume in the past before, so it's pretty apparent what's going on when a 5 feet 4 inches Enderman shows up on the doorstep with a man carrying a skull cup. Or woman. Or whatever people other than me see him as. And the man with the skull cup just solemnly intoned, "Trick or treat," as each door opened for us, and then stood there, his cup clutched in both hands until the homeowner handed me the candy, not really sure what else to do. I hadn't brought a bag, so I took off my Enderman head and used that to store the candy in. Then we reached the house, and after receiving our candy, the man in the skull cup offered the person at the door a drink. I stood a pace behind the man and I frantically pantomimed to the homeowner to take a sip. They did, their eyes wide and fixed on me the whole time. Then the man with the skull cup walked away, and I followed him, casting nervous glances backward to the person that had just been poisoned. That wasn't the only person he offered a drink to. I started to sweat, despite the cold air. Drops of perspiration beaded up on the back of my neck, and I was flushed with anxiety, watching all this unfold. After about an hour, I began to notice a trend in which houses he offered a drink. Are you only poisoning the people giving out shitty candy? I asked. Maybe, he replied with a thin smile. Now, while this may sound amusing, just think back to how I said the people in town haven't all read the rules. I'm sure some of them were hugging their toilets last night. But it wasn't until the last house of the night that I ran into trouble. It was getting close to 10 and most of the kids had gone home. The porch lights were starting to go out. The man with the skull cup was walking quickly now, up to the last house on the edge of town. The streets were dark with shadows, as we'd left streetlights far behind. I'm sorry, I just ran out of candy, the woman who answered the door said, visibly growing more nervous as she took in who I was and who I was with. It is tradition to present all that visit with a gift, the man with the skull cup said cordially, and he held out his cup in one hand and a knife in the other. I understood what he was asking. I know how these things go. Behind him, I pantomimed the woman cutting her palm open with the knife while mouthing the word sacrifice to her. I saw comprehension dawn in her eyes, and she nervously took the knife from him and put the point to her palm. She seemed surprised at how easily it cut through her skin. His knife is very sharp. Then I mimicked turning her hand over, and she did this and let the blood drip freely into the bowl of his cup. We stood there for a few moments, the woman growing pale, not from the blood loss, but from the sight of it, from the growing pain in her palm as the nerve endings finally realized what was happening. Then the man thanked her. She snatched her hand back and clutched at her wrist as if she could hold back all sensation, and the man turned to go. I followed. Behind us, I heard the door slam shut and the heavy click of a deadbolt. Old blood from what was in the cup before, the man with the skull cup murmured as we walked back to the street. New blood is freely given. I need only one more ingredient to refill my cup. Wait, refill? You have to refill it? He did, he said. I just hadn't noticed, or at least, I hadn't made the connection when I found the bodies. The ones with their throats slit. And his eyes slid sideways toward where I stood beside him, slowly growing cold inside at the realization of what he was saying. The last ingredient. Blood was forcibly taken. And I made the turn, to run, but he seized my hair and wrenched my head sideways, and I felt briefly the line of his knife against my neck. Then I twisted and pulled, and I left behind a clump of my hair, but I was free and running down the road. The line across my neck burning as it bled freely into my shirt, but it was intact. My artery was intact. I was heading away from town by necessity. The man stood between me and the safety of the houses. I'd cut across the field, I thought desperately, and circled back towards town. I'm in shape from all the work I do on the campground, but I'm not a runner. That's a different kind of athleticism. I quickly exhausted my stamina and was reduced to a fast walk, clutching a hand against the stitch in my side. My neck stung where his knife had broken skin, but the blood flow was slowing. I angled my direction more towards the beckoning lights of the town. I was quickly running out of the field. There were trees ahead. I couldn't tell if it was merely a windbreak or a stretch of forest. Then I saw, somewhat behind me and to my right, the man with the skull cup. He walked at an even pace, cutting a straight line between me and my destination so that even if I sprinted I'd run the risk of being intercepted. Even if I could sprint. So I changed tactics. I'd head back towards the campground. That was a straight line, and if I could reach the gate, I could get my hands on the bundle that guarded it and whatever it was that he feared inside. Have you heard of persistence hunting? You walk an animal to death. You keep pace with it so that every time it slows, you're right there, threatening it, spurring it to keep moving, keep going, step after weary step until it finally collapses of exhaustion. I didn't have my cell phone on me because it had fallen out of my pocket in my struggle to break free of his grip. This is why women need real pockets on their clothing. My pants barely fit my cell phone in the best of circumstances. Worse, it was late enough at night that the road was deserted, and so without any hope of rescue, I had no choice but to keep going. And each time I looked back, the man with the skull cup was there. I collapsed long before I reached the campground. My thoughts were hazy at that point, worn thin by exhaustion, and I remember thinking that all this was futile, that I was dealing with creatures far more powerful than I, and my time was simply up. That it'd be easier to give in than to keep going for a minute longer. And that resignation broke as soon as I heard gravel crunch under his feet as he approached. I struggled to stand, my legs burning with pain, and I stumbled blindly forward, driven only by an instinct to survive, pushed well beyond the limits of my endurance. His hand closed on my hair, right at the roots, and he jerked backward. I stumbled and fell, and then he was straddling my legs, pinning them in place, and he twisted his wrist to force my head back and expose my throat. His body felt cool against my back. Not cold, just not as warm as a human should feel. I clawed at his wrist as he raised the knife. I'm surprised at how clear my thoughts were that I was going to die, and I wondered if this was how my father felt as he walked out to meet the beast. Like floating. Like the world didn't exist anymore, and it was just myself, along with the beat of my own heart. The knife point slipped along the line of my throat, and there was no pain, and I waited for my body to catch up, waited for the hot blood to soak my shirt, and then his wrist shifted again, and there was a flash of pain along my jaw. He dropped the knife and picked up the cup, holding it just below my chin, and now I felt the heat of blood trickling along my neck, saw it dripping into the cup and mixing with the blood and water already present inside. Then he released me and took the cup away. I pressed a shaking hand against the cut on my jaw and watched the blood run down my wrist and soak into the sleeve of my shirt. It was a long time before I could speak. I thought you were going to kill me, I whispered. Perhaps I was, he murmured. Would it have been forcibly taken if you'd known you weren't going to die? Wouldn't you have simply acquiesced, knowing that it was easier to submit than to fight the inevitable? But why me? A selfish question, perhaps. But I've grown accustomed to others being the ones that die and I the one that lives. It's my gift to you. A reminder of the dangers of your campground. After all, familiarity breeds complacency. Think of how your mother died. I'd prefer you lasted a little while longer yet. He walked away. I watched him go, dizzy with pain, shaking with exhaustion. When he was no longer within eyeshot, I simply lay down there on the shoulder of the road, and there I lay until my staff thought to come looking for me and took me back to my home. I wish I could say that my ordeal was the only consequence of this incident. See, we have a tenuous relationship with the town at times. Not everyone feels the benefits of the campground outweigh the dangers. After the man with the skull cup poisoned several locals, they decided to reopen the issue. There's a town meeting in a few weeks. My presence is requested. I'm a campground manager. I spend much of my time preoccupied with the unnatural, with things that have their own rules and customs, and I suppose I've ignored other threats, the human threats, and our tendency towards blind, rash panic when threatened. I think I forgot myself inside my helpless anger and insulted the wrong person. I wish Halloween was uneventful. I wish my problems were not of my own making this time. At least the man with the skull cup is in my debt, in exchange for opening the gate. Please don't let your children go trick-or-treating alone. Like most of you, Halloween has always held a special place in my heart. It's a time of year when the veil between reality and fantasy thins and life's usual rules are suspended for a night of childhood fun. This is a story about those annual nights of candy-fueled mischief, a story that has haunted me for years. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. Every Halloween, my friends and I would pool together in ever-changing groups to go trick-or-treating. Friends of friends would show up, unfamiliar faces from the next town over, transient Halloween allies that drifted in and out of our lives like apparitions. There was one kid, though. A girl who was more ghost than human. She always wore the same costume every year, a wolf mask, and introduced herself as Spooky. No one knew where she came from or who brought her, but every Halloween, like clockwork, she'd be there, her amber eyes flashing from behind the wolf mask. She had a magnetism that was impossible to resist, a charm that bewitched us all. Spooky was the one who introduced us to trick and treat, an evolved version of trick-or-treating where we'd play tricks even if we got candy. It started innocently enough, toilet papering houses or ringing doorbells and hiding. The thrill of being a bit naughty was intoxicating, especially under Spooky's spell. I had a bit of a crush on her, despite never seeing her without the wolf mask. But she never showed interest in anyone. She was more excited about getting at least one of every kind of candy we got. "You got to get the full set," she'd say, making it our unofficial motto. As the years went by, Spooky's tricks began to escalate. The once fun-loving pranks took a darker turn, becoming more malicious. Rocks through windows, trash cans set on fire, pets stolen. It started to make me uncomfortable, but I never said anything, not wanting to disappoint her. When I was 12, I got sick on Halloween. I missed out on that year's festivities. I remember how frustrated I was, feeling left out. But that feeling turned to dread the next day when I discovered my friends hadn't come home from trick-or-treating. An extensive search was launched. Days turned into weeks, and hope turned into despair. Finally, they found my friends' bodies in a network of nearby caves, drowned when the tide came in. Spooky, however, was never found. No one in town knew who she was or where she came from. I moved away from that town when I grew up. The memories were too painful. I started a family and tried to put the past behind me. But some specters refused to stay buried. My son, now the same age I was when I used to go trick-or-treating with Spooky, recently brought up Halloween. I found a drawing in his room, a crude sketch of a girl in a wolf mask with the name Spooky scribbled underneath. My heart froze. Was this a coincidence, or was history repeating itself? My son told me one of his friends had introduced him to a new girl, Spooky. He said she had the most beautiful amber eyes. I have decided that my son will not go trick-or-treating alone next year, or any year following. I can't help but wonder if Spooky is a real person, a cursed spirit, or the embodiment of Halloween mischief gone too far. But there's one thing I do know: I won't let my son be claimed by her games, her tricks, and treats. I won't lose him like I lost my friends. So remember, folks, when Halloween comes around, Keep your kids close, and always check their candy. You never know what or who might be lurking in the shadows. The allure of the full set can sometimes lead to a very different kind of collection.